league's next world champion, a show about the LCK, determining who's the best in the LCK, and then unofficially dubbing them league's next world champion until usually around, I think it's October, when they just officially, they go through the motions of just also officially crowning them as league's next world champion. So, usual host Thorin, usual co-host Emily Rand, formerly of Yahoo Esports. Just don't know why I'm just bringing that up as some sort of and here's a horrible thing that happened to her in the last few years, but she's still going, still around, still believes, You
can't kill the old girl yet,
Exactly.
Yeah.
As a Katie Arrows fan, if you can't just accept living with having seen the best days and know they'll never come again, then what's the point in being a Katie Arrows fan? She understands that deep down, Kelsey. She knows that it's all a slow, gradual decline downhill from here, much like Western civilization, sometimes I feel. So, okay, obviously our guest for this episode, Ruby Red over there, Kelsey Moser, a.k.a. Karen Moser, as overlays have been saying to my subconscious brain for hundreds of episodes of shows. And I have to say that you have to give me credit. I think I've only said it by accident once, but I did say it once. I think it was on Summon Insight, actually. But what's funny is I think everyone just let it go at the time. What's bizarre is no one called me on it, even though I definitely did just say Karen. And then you answered anyway, though, to be fair. So
at this point, I get it so often that I just can't tell the difference anymore. I just hear Karen as Kelsey. So
does it ever happen in when you meet someone in esports? Does it ever happen that basically they've just misremembered your name as Karen and they call you Karen, but you don't you don't have the heart to say it? Like, I'm actually Kelsey. Have you ever just gone along with it?
I usually just go along with it because I'm not too picky. Obviously, if I were extremely picky about what I was being called, I would have
wait a minute, you're not even
chosen
picky about what you're being called.
Anyway, so yeah.
People can just say something vaguely with a K in your direction. You go, good enough.
Yeah, I guess part of it is just bred from constantly being referred to as Chelsea throughout my childhood. So I just
what?
Why would people call you Chelsea?
Because Kelsey, for whatever reason, when I was a kid, was a really uncommon name. So people just always assumed that my name must be Chelsea. So
you had the opposite problem of me, where there were 6 Emilys in my grade growing up.
Yeah. That's
so many of us.
I can't believe we've just gotten that little sort of insight into the inner workings of Kelsey's childhood social trauma, where she just learned to accept being called a name that's actually nothing like hers, just because, it's too late. And here's the thing, you can't argue with everyone, Kelsey, as we've all learned in our lives. You've got to pick your battles. So, okay, as everyone could probably guess who's watching the episode, listen, I can't come up with straight fire guests every week. Kelsey absolutely does know about the LCK. Also didn't feel like just doing another episode where I try and wring information about EU LCS out of her. So we'll delay that torture until a date when it absolutely must be done. So this could be one of the best episodes we've ever had, Emily. These are people who can go into depth, who have their own perspective on the game. They've modelled the game differently. Also, crucially, all people who have different history with other regions. They can draw sort of parallels and stuff. But everyone who's seen these episodes before does know this is also some sort of hyperbolic time chamber workout for me to get some sort of social lubricant going here, some sort of light upbeat aspect. Because listen, viewers, you know what these girls are like. It's like a fucking chess match, isn't it? Takes them 5 minutes to respond. Now, with that said, we're just going to have to take a cue from Korean League of Legends of the past, okay? It's like playing the early game against Samsung Blue. It doesn't actually matter what you do at the beginning of the game. You're still going to have to get to the very end, know what they're doing, and somehow adapt to that. So don't worry about this first part now. We'll get deep into stuff. And here's the thing, though. I actually hope, this is my secret one dream and aim for this episode, is that we can actually provoke within Kelsey some sort of antipathy towards Emily. Because here's the thing, they get along so well on these shows. But if I just was to put a whole bunch of other people in esports in Emily's place and have them say the same opinions, I know Kelsey would bite on at least one and she would just go off completely. So I just want to find a way to engineer that moment. So with all the cards on the table now, we can start the episode. So obviously the big storyline for LCK is that we were coming up to the playoffs. And I have to say this at the beginning because everyone always forgets this part because it actually makes no sense in the format of how it works. But always remember that in the Koreans' mind, actually only 4 teams make the playoffs. Now you're all thinking, that doesn't make sense because every single year, 5 teams do and then they just play the first round. No, you are mistaken, you silly, stupid Westerner. That's actually not the first round. That's some sort of wild card
The wild
playoff,
card round,
which basically may as well just be called the first round of the playoffs. Alternatively, 5th place decider. That would be another name I might give it. But again, Emily, it's not for me as a fucking savage Westerner to question the refined ways of the LCK. So obviously the whole controversy of the last week and a half has been, would SK Telecom make it to the said wildcard match into the playoffs, coming from a position where, to refresh everyone's memory, they actually didn't have like an impossible schedule. They had one that was somewhat doable. KSV also, in theory, was supposed to have the easier one. And basically, from what I remember, it was the Rocks Tigers that had the hardest path, right? Is that vaguely the way it was, Emily?
Yeah, Rocks. So Rocks and KSV played each other, and then all Rocks had to do was beat Jinner, who is, yes, I would say, a tougher team than MVP or Kongdu, who is that's who SKT had to play. So SKT basically had to play the bottom 2 teams.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in this scenario, then SKT was very likely to make it.
Yeah.
And they still almost didn't.
Okay, I think a lot of the hype was generated, oh my gosh, they might almost not make it. And then you see their schedule and it's like, yeah, sure. Okay. I'm really falling for this level of hype here.
It's because, here's the thing, the sad part is there was a time where it looked like they might not do it. Because, for example, they lost to BBQ, which obviously was supposed to be a win on the sheet. And then the key thing was they were going to play KSV. And if KSV were at all coming back, that could have been like the key match. But the problem is once they won that match there, as we said here, you basically had to beat MVP and Kongdu Monsters, the worst teams in the league. At the end of the league as well, by the way, when logically they have almost nothing to play for. And so, yeah, unfortunately, that wasn't really as exciting. So let's just ask this instead then. The nature of their run into the playoffs, was it actually convincing, Emily?
No. Especially the Kongdu series. It was... Kongdu almost beat them. Basically, they ended up in this situation where they all went in 1 by 1 and died in game 3.
Like a really inexplicable series. Like, here's the thing. People have overused the term inting, but this was close to it, right?
Like, that people were joking on Twitter, and I don't think this happened at all, by the way, but people were joking. They were like, oh, that check from SKT cleared, so now it's, like, time to go in 1 by 1.
Each of them had one of those Samsung smartwatches, and what happened is, like, the little notification popped up, like, PayPal transaction. Like, oh, okay, cool, right, my turn. And in I go. Just a joke, of course. We all know the SK Telecom organisation would never be involved in any sort of match fixing. I'm obviously just laughing because of how absolutely hilarious and ludicrous the proposition is. So, anyway, back to reality, Emily, where they definitely didn't
I don't actually think that happened, but because we've seen Kongdu do this multiple times throughout the season, so it's actually not a character for them. But I wasn't impressed by SKT going into the playoffs. I'm a bit concerned about them because I actually thought that of the 2 teams, KSV looked slightly better. I think their like major problem is a lot more obvious too in trying to find champions for Crown. But I especially after the Kongdu series, I was like, oof. It's rough.
And SKT are up to their old tricks of drafting no winning lanes, no win conditions, It's just, against Kongdu, it certainly will work, right? Because these guys can't close a game. So I guess, like, it's frustrating to me to see SKT doing this over and over again, where they might have one lane setup that's really good. Like maybe their ball lane setup is a 50-50 or something, but then their laners aren't going to be strong enough to capitalize, or they won't capitalize. And they're leaning very heavily on specific jungle picks, I think. Like, for example, when they're bringing Blank back, the Zac pick works really, really well for them because this is a force mid meta, and Zac is really, really good at ganking mid. Like, it really sucks to play mid as an overextending mid lane champion against a Zac. It's just really obnoxious. So I think that's part of what they're doing, is they're just all inning on this idea of Faker being successful, and then Blank is a very good Zac player. They can tide over the side lanes and hope that nothing bad happens, and then they'll just win the game by getting first mid turret or something like this.
Okay.
And sometimes it works for them. Obviously, I think the best counter to Kongdu Monster is what all three of the best counter against SKT is what all three of the top teams do, which is try to draft winning lane matchups, So,
okay, so Emily, the big problem here, okay, for anyone who's got a rough thread of what we've talked about on the shows in the past, there was obviously the middle part of the split was when SKT was actually doing pretty well. Everything was looking good. It's when they actually had done the hard swap to using Tal and Blossom. And then what happened was they did a swap back to Ontara briefly, but they did still keep Blossom in most of the games. And then it was around about, I think it was the KT Rolster series actually. They did the hard swap black to blank. And since then, Blossom has not been seen, and it's just blank the whole way. And in line with what Kelsey was saying there, it doesn't seem like they just were doing it against specific teams. And it looks as though they've just decided they're going with this formation with blank, and that whatever they think it brings to the team is what they're going to go with. So the problem is, what I'm sort of setting up here is we can't really build on all the great things we said with the Blossom, right? Because it looks like it's going to be blank, right? In the playoffs,
we haven't seen Blossom since he got destroyed by Peanuts Olaf. I don't know if that was so demoralizing for him that he's had trouble since, or if it's just one of these typical things where Koma's you had a really bad performance, so we're going to go with the quote unquote safer option, which, as we know, and I've said week after week after week, I wish they had just committed to Blossom regardless, let him make his mistakes. He was already making mistakes, but the team just looked a lot more interesting. They were doing more proactive things, and now it just seems like they're doing exactly what they did last year with a slightly worse roster. And I mean, what Kelsey said, if you're gonna play around anyone on this team, you will play around Faker, right? That totally makes sense. Sure. But at the same time, it is just really frustrating to watch them pretty much do the same thing that they have previously instead of trying to move forward or move in a different direction, especially when last year was the year that they were, finally punished for it.
Yes. Well, seemingly, because they didn't win the World Championship. As we might find out this playoff run here, there are layers to how you can be punished. Some people, punishment is you don't get to even go to the LCK final. No, Coma's like, what are you talking about? Maybe I could lose in the finals. Okay, what about this then? Because obviously they're about to embark on a playoff run, and despite all the different discussions that I've had about SK Telecom, a lot of people still do expect some sort of clutch factor to kick in, or for example, fair enough, other teams to maybe underperform in the playoffs, and therefore maybe SKT can do some inspired run. Since they're playing KSV in the first round, what do you actually think the chances are, Emily? We've obviously had this matchup a couple of weeks ago, but
I mean, previously I would have said SKT for sure, but in this past week, outside of, I think it was their first game against Kingzone where they had Haru playing Camille jungle, I actually thought that KSV were trying to be slightly more proactive early, which is a good sign for them. Again, their main problem has been their lack of mid priority, and trying to find champions for Crown. They found the Vel'Koz, and then obviously teams starting with SK Telecom, who SKT swept them in their second meeting. They started banning it, and then all of a sudden KSV started struggling again. But if you had asked me before the final week, I would have said SKT. But now, I mean, I think KSV is looking better going into this matchup. I think that Faker will still be able to have mid priority. I don't know. If KSV can commit to actually being more proactive early, like they were kind of showing glimmers of last week, then I would pick KSV.
How did the two teams match up?
It's a toss-up, especially since it's a best of 3. Like, it's not even a best of 5.
Well, that's the other factor I didn't mention, is that, yes, the other reason why it's the wild card is because you only play a best of 3, not the full best of 5. Okay, but so in that scenario then, let's start with that then. Mm-hmm. Does the best of 3, who does the best of 3 improve odds for?
I don't really think it matters that much either way, whether it's a best of 3 or a best of 5, because I think that it will be pretty easy to see, because I think, interestingly enough, that SKT and KSV both have like really specific mid lane centered problems, and a lot of them rely on like the interaction of side lanes with mid. I think that that's like a really big thing. I think, for example, with KSV, there has been some issues with back timings, and by what I mean by that is like when bottom lane is backing, ambition doesn't really react. So when your bottom lane is backing, that opens up for enemy jungler to do something because they have more people on the map. They have their bot lane on the map. The bot lane can get priority. People can roam mid. They can influence mid like that. And it feels like Crown and KSV are kind of having trouble reacting to situations where bottom lane has priority to back first. So I also think they don't put a lot of emphasis on getting first back for their mid as much. They're basically just trying to make it so that he doesn't get... They're reinforcing mid. They're thinking of like stopping holes in mid lane rather than just like making sure mid lane has priority and the side lanes are safe and the side lanes are moving towards mid. Whereas I also feel like SKT have a similar issue where they're trying to use mid lane to move towards sides more. And you're not necessarily, you don't, like the reason why I think they're going with Blank as opposed to Blossom is SKT do not have the lane support for Blossom, I don't think. Like, I don't think their side lanes are consistently winning. There isn't backup for the way that Blossom wants to play, which is to go in and like fuck people up, whatever else.
Yeah.
And then they just don't have the lane support for him. They have the lane support for Zach that's going to farm and then do really well in mid-game centric team fights. So I think
so do you agree with putting Blank in then? Is that what it sounds like you're saying, right?
I do if their focus is on winning and if they're not going to like get side lanes that they think are going to consistently win, then I think that focusing on having tank jungles team fight might be their best option.
Okay.
I don't know.
Emily, what about then the scenario with Antara and Tal then? Like, Tal wasn't capable of being this sideline carry or threat?
Not really. I mean, there were more than a few times where he kind of played too far up in lane and got punished for it. Again, like sometimes that was because Faker and Blossom, like, they had some major miscommunication issues because it was the first few weeks that they were trying Tal out with that lineup, I believe. So it was like they would have, when you have those kind of miscommunication issues with either back timing or when the wave is pushing, or like Faker famously getting caught out and like dying really far up in mid when he should have had the backup from the jungler. But Blossom had backed. I forget what game I'm specifically thinking of, but Faker was playing Azir. Anyway, that all kind of affects where Tal can play, and I don't think he really adjusted well to that. Whereas in Tara, he's going to be a bit more safe. That does mean that, I mean, you kind of already know what you're going to get from Tara, so you're not really looking for him to light the world on fire. And sometimes I think he has a similar problem of pushing up too far, but he's overall a safer laner. And I think that's probably why they're using him, and that's probably why they kind of brought him in with Blossom as well, like towards the end of it, if I recall. I also just realized that with these two teams, we could see like both teams draft to late game. So
I think
that could be tough.
I think what's most likely to happen is that we'll get like strong top lane pick for QV.
Yeah.
They'll focus on doing that, and then they'll focus on directing that pressure to mid lane with ambition. and then reinforcing mid, and in that sense, to try to restrict Faker in that way, and they'll work on winning from there. However, I don't think that's necessarily like the best approach or the best way to win the game right now, since I think a lot of Dragon focus is going to shift things a lot to bot lane. It kind of depends on what patch this is on. Is it going to be on 8.6 or 8.5? Do you know?
As far as I know, it's going to be on 8.6.
Okay, so that might make that actually might swing things more in KSV's favor, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It doesn't say, but I believe it's going to be on 8.6. Since they didn't switch immediately at the end of the season, they stayed on 8.5, and then they, I think, said 8.6 for playoffs.
So one thing I have actually always really enjoyed doing, especially when I'm actually doing analysis and I'm on CSGO desks, is if there's a bracket draw where there's a match in the first round, but like it doesn't really matter who wins this match because like neither team's going to win the title, nobody's going to the final, you know, like the two of them fighting, even if it's a great match, is just sort of like who gets to lose next. In this scenario here, right, and the reason why I like to do that for obvious reasons is because everyone else goes the opposite way and nearly always tries to pretend like every team can win the title and, you know, like do that ridiculous narrative that, listen, while they have improved, I call it the LCS broadcast narrative, which is like the storyline is the same no matter who the opponent is. So if you win the first round match against a bad team, it's like, and they started off really strong, then they went in the next match, it's like, well, that doesn't really matter if the next opponent is 10 times harder. So basic question is this. Is there anything that you could see happening? Is there something that would need to emerge for either of these teams to have a chance to actually go to the final, maybe even win the title? KSV and SKT. How plausible is it? What would need to happen, do you think, to change your mind?
I think, man, it's hard because I actually do still think that KSV have a pretty strong matchup against KT, but I don't see them going further than that. And that's only just because they, back when Pawn was playing it, some of Crown's issues were mitigated by the fact that Pawn had similar issues with mid priority, and also that KSV has shown that they are more than willing to wait for KT to make these mid-game mistakes. Yes. But it's really hard to see either of these teams getting successive best of fives against Afrika and KT. I think for KSV, for me, what needs to happen is they need to be a little bit stronger in their early game, which would require finding a pick for Crown where he will actually just be able to hold mid without them paying too much attention to it, without them having to rotate the jungle or top or support to help him out.
Does he play Kale?
What?
Does he play Kale?
Maybe. I was actually surprised that we didn't see the Victor come back, but just because he's like, I was like, you're running out of champions anyway, might as well throw it out there and try, right? Like he has a lot of wave clear.
Like the stuff that he's picking up and the stuff that he's playing is definitely for mid control, and Victor is like shit in lane, by the way. So yeah,
I guess that's true. But yeah, because he's picked up Vel'Koz and Karma.
Yeah, and he actually played Azir one game, I think, too, which I was surprised by. But yeah.
Yeah, well, because they usually pick or ban the Talia from him because he is still good on that champion. So,
what do you think, Kelsey? Is there a chance for either of them, or some path that they could follow?
Oh gosh, I just think that there is a fundamental problem with both of these teams and controlling like the bot side river. And I know I'm kind of obsessed with like this area, but I think that you need really solid synergy between your jungle, mid, and support, and for all three of these roles to be like firing off really well. And I think almost every other team in the top three does that better. You
also have Effort, who is like visibly not as strong as, like, you can dunk on Wolf a lot, but in terms of communication, he's a lot stronger than what Effort has shown as well for vision rotations.
And I don't know if it's Bang or what, but this bot lane very rarely pressures matchups where they should get an advantage. Like, they're much happier to just like freeze or something, which gives up so much bot side control. It really bothers me. So
I feel like it has to be either Bang or a team thing. Like, either that or someone on the team is telling them, because Bang and Wolf were like that a lot too, where they just wouldn't pressure specific matchups.
So in the next round, we have KT Roster, and being as the way that the LCK playoffs work, where you have a time between the matchups, there's no point like dry running the whole bracket. I think for the other teams, it's better to just talk about each of the teams, we can just do that way. So, okay, Kelsey, I want to get your take on this first. So one of the bizarre things about this KT Roster lineup was that if you ever went through the problems they had, and obviously some of the problems are seemingly like, intangible things, like how people's communication is and how they work together as a team and stuff. So that sort of stuff is always going to be very difficult to speculate on or come to anything from. But one thing that, funnily enough, almost everyone has always pointed out about this specific lineup, but no one ever bizarrely thought there was ever a solution to, was Pawn. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that Pawn was really good ever since he came to KT Roster. Yet, bizarrely, no one ever even considered the idea they might swap him out or might bring someone else in. But they have done that this split. And in fact, towards the end of the split, they went with the hard swap. They went with Yukal, this new player, to be the mid laner. Assuming he continues on into the playoffs, what do you think that changes about the dynamic of KT Roster?
I think Yukal has been a significantly better player than Pawn. I do think people were calling for Pawn to be replaced, but
no one believed it would happen, though. That's the thing, isn't it? The bizarre thing about that team is people all had the logic that, like, they're all such big names, how could you remove anyone, which you'd hope isn't the case, but sadly was for a long time.
Yeah, so I do think that Yukal, like, the thing that I really like about KT Roster is they seem to have a really, really strong understanding of lane matchups. And they really operate out of this kind of mentality of, we will have like good lane matchups, but it's not this really straightforward idea of really good lane matchups, which is we will just win the early game hard in 1v1 and 2v2, because they'll have provisions for late game. Like, for example, in the first game against Freaks, they had like the super strong Kalista Braum lane that's just gonna like beat the shit out of you and then be useless. And I do not recommend usually drafting Kalista in the current state of the game, like, ever. But the thing is that if you look at the picks that they chose for mid and top, these champions scale and have ridiculous pressure in almost every like matchup. So they will have super strong sides. Their bot lane gets ahead to a point where they control the mid game really well, and then they just have super strong sides, and side lanes can't contest them. Afrika weren't able to get the answer to Camille off the ground in the Fiora, and it was just like a really good execution of that kind of idea. So I like KT's approach to draft and the way that KT look at lane matchups and the way KT look at the game. I just think that they have a lot of issues with execution in terms of like resetting after a play when they get so many advantages, or in terms of like setting up vision, Baron vision before committing to it, things like this. So I don't know, like I feel like Yukal, which was the original question, by the way, just makes their drafts a lot better as well, because Yukal will play a bunch of these champions that I think Pawn didn't, or that didn't fit into Pawn's playstyle. And then Yukal will be able to like work this in with the team a lot more. So, yeah.
So, Emily, here's the bizarre thing. While, yes, everyone would have wanted Pawn to at least be the person you could try someone else out. And so, the one player in theory on the team you would never say to swap out is Score. But obviously in the last game, which technically didn't matter, they did swap him out and they brought in fan favourite, ladder legend, and former tip player, Rush. And he came in, and it almost was like some sort of mad fan service, because on the last game he even played Lee Sin as well and tried to just pop off, etc. So do you believe they will actually use this as some sort of component of the playoff campaign, and maybe he will be used? Like from the way they used him, do you suspect this was just because it was the last game? What's your thoughts on it?
I'm like 50-50. I think so. When I was first watching this, I was like, oh man, like Rush is gonna stream in a few days, and like guess what, he did. And I was like, oh okay, like KT, like I see what you're doing. But in terms of how he performed a lot better than I expected. And I think a lot of it is really, like, everyone was talking about Rush in these games, but the star for me was definitely UCal. And for Rush to play, you absolutely have to have a reliable mid laner who can get priority and have the push in lane. And they had that both times with Rush and UCal in the Freak series. So I think in that case, it worked really well because they were like, okay, we're going to rely on UCal to have this kind of pressure mid. That basically unlocks Rush because he's not going to be the same type of jungler scorer. So I think, I'm not sure if they'd use it in playoffs. Like, initially I would have said absolutely not. That's insane. But after having watched them play, I think it could be a viable option. I'm still a huge fan of Score in terms of not necessarily like a fan, but like I really appreciate his style of jungling and his intelligence about how he goes about the game. And I still don't think Rush has that. But I do think now that they have UCal, if they did want to try Rush and just go for this kind of like more smash your face in, even heavier early game, because a lot of people have been ripping apart KT for their early game, but they're still like one of the best early game teams statistically in the region. So I'm not really, I guess just because they're not like smashing people's face in, people maybe don't see it as much because they were used to how the team operated last year. But I think having UCal makes a huge difference that makes Rush a lot more viable of an option than I would have previously thought. Just don't play Rush and Pawn together. Okay. Please. No.
I had major issues with KT's early game in the King Zone series. Let's put it that way. I thought that was poorly. I have no idea what they were doing in that series. Just flat
They've done that twice against King Zone.
Which it makes no sense because they were like the team that consistently beat Longju last year. Yeah. And now they completely have changed their approach. It's like, oh, we forgot how we beat these guys. Shh, secret. It's the same way. You could do that again. It'll work, probably.
Well, and also their drafting didn't match up to their, like I ranted about this on the last show, but like their drafting did not match up to their execution either.
See, I think she needs to use that mechanism more, that like sort of like whispering voice she just did that. At the moment in her game, she only has a limited skill set, right? She has like a sort of satirical, annoying pretend voice that she does and people like, that's the only one though. She doesn't have, see, we're getting new depth here already. Now we've got the whispering voice, which is sarcastically giving you constructive criticism. I like that. Let's work that mechanism in the future. Keep that one in the toolkit. Do you believe though that they will use Rush though? Because I mean, in line with what Emily said, it's not even like you have to use him for the whole series, but it certainly gives you a certain direction if you put him in for one specific game.
Yeah, I think the way that their approach to playing against Freaks, I think lended itself well to having Rush play, just because.
And obviously, they may well end up playing the Freaks again if they win their playoff series.
Yeah, and I didn't necessarily agree with his first rotation pathing or anything like that, but like after first back and stuff, I think he played the game fairly straightforward to how their comp should play, like just dive their bot over and over again, things like this. We have Zyra Rakan, Callista Braum, should be pretty straightforward in terms of how we want to execute this. So I think it was a pretty good setup from them to play Rush, and I think it worked very well. And I think that on 8-5 in particular, like it's a really good time to just focus bot because all of the dragons are good. You can rotate this pressure to mid like really easily. Yeah, there you go.
So, okay, another thing that happened in this last game was that UCal played Swain. Will we see Swain played mid in the LCK playoffs?
I think Swain is still a really good champion. Yeah. So, yeah.
And what's the logic behind it at the moment?
I think that Swain is just like a really strong champion in almost every 2v2 jungle matchup, especially with Zac on the table. Like Zac, you can proc like the Swain pull from his passive on almost every Zac move. Swain is stupid in team fights. Like if you're against any short range champion, regardless, he basically wins fights from like 5k gold deficits. I don't know. This champion is just really strong. So, yeah.
Because I did notice a lot of teams, I mean, basically being banned every game except when it's picked. So, who would be the teams most likely? Because presumably, if people are going to ban it, you're going to have to pick it pretty early, right? So, who do you think are the teams in the playoffs are likely to play it?
So, I think teams, it's easier to look at this as teams that are likely to open it. I think teams that play like Karma or longer range kind of kiting mid champions will think that they can get away with it. I think that you can play like teams that want to play Gnar into it. I think it's really annoying to open on red side because it's really annoying to open if the enemy team is on red side because you can flex it super easily and you don't necessarily have to give away whether you're playing it top or mid until the very last pick. But there are a few strategies that you can play against it if you have red side. So, yeah, I think it's far more likely to be the case that it's like banned on blue or something like this. So,
Emily,
Yes.
Katie Rolster, potential champion of the LCK.
I don't think this split. I actually think if they continue to develop UCal, I think they definitely could be a really strong summer team. With UCal and starting in mid for the entire split. But I think right now they're still inconsistent. They're still integrating him onto the team. They still make a lot of execution errors, as we've discussed. They push things when they shouldn't, and they sometimes fall back when they should push, and they don't necessarily execute mid and late game neutral objective setups very well. And a lot of it's like a timing thing. It's not even like they don't necessarily know what to do. They just don't do it at the right time. So I think if they continue to play UCal, they could definitely be a summer team. But I think that the most they can do is make the finals and lose. Despite the fact that I actually also believe if they took into consideration how they attacked Longzhu last year, as we spoke to, or how they could face Kingzone, and even to some extent they drafted for this and just didn't execute it correctly, they could theoretically beat Kingzone. But I don't think the team is there yet. I think they still make way too many mistakes.
Okay. Right. Kelsey, what do you think? Any chance?
I don't know. I don't think it's like that. It really depends because I feel like some games KT just don't seem to have a plan, or they're just picking champions that they think are like, I praise their draft and this type of setup really well, but some games it's just really infuriating. It's like, we're going to pick our best champs. And then there's no plan. You're camping at top lane with a really good like Zyra Khan setup. And yeah, that's KT. So I feel like there's just there has to be something really weird going on internally. I also think that Kingzone are much better at using sideline pressure in late game to set up for Baron. So if it gets to a head where KT are leading the game, like Kingzone are way more likely to come back into it. So yeah, I don't think they win, but I don't think it's like it would be for me, it's more like 20-30 than like 90% chance that Kingzone win, if that makes sense. Whereas I feel like a lot of people will say like, there's no chance, you know? So. Okay.
Oh, I have a question. Now, when we now talk about Africa Freaks, I have a quick question to double check Emily. Right? When Aiming got that like suspension or whatever he got for, wasn't it like some like one of those like, things where he posted on like the Korean version of 4chan?
Yeah.
Drug it all up or whatever. What is the suspension for? Is he just out of the whole split? Can he play in the playoffs? Do you know?
As far as I know, he's suspended through playoffs.
Right.
But it was a team. Yeah. So here's the thing: it was a team punishment. It wasn't like a.
Right. It wasn't a
LCK
themselves. Okay.
Yeah. So like, yeah. So I think I mean, they could, theoretically, if they felt like they were in trouble or whatever and they really wanted to play aiming, they could probably be like, well, his suspension's over, and like put him back in. But
Okay.
I don't think they do that, because Korean teams are usually really strict about, like, you know, immediately punishing their players if they feel like they've done something wrong. So I think that you won't see him in the playoffs. I still was not sold on the aiming hype, so I think it'd be better to play Kramer anyway, but it's just me.
So instead of the porn version where, you know, he's on his hospital bed and he's like, tell me, nurse, how goes EDG? And then they're like, oh, it's really bad porn. It's getting to game 5. And he runs off. Instead of that, this is obviously one of those, like, you know, Thunderbolt Suicide Squad type scenarios where they're like, you know, game 4, they like take the break and then they come in. We'll give you a full pardon if you win this game for us. but understand, you are under our control the entire time. He's like, okay, I'll come out for this one game. Right, okay, what do you think about that then, Kelsey? Because on the last episode we had, I think it was the last one, I believe Noddle was actually the guy who was like actually quite critical of Kramer. And I know some people think he's like overhyped and some people think he is really good. So where did you come down on that one anyway?
On Kramer? I think that Kramer only works in very specific setups. And he can carry out those setups pretty well for the most part. Sometimes he just like throws gold into items that are not useful. But otherwise, I think he is able to play, like, if you want to play an 80 carry, like hyper carry centric type style, you go for Kramer and that works out. But if you want to play like win bot, transfer pressure to another lane or something like this, I don't think Kramer is your best guy. So I don't think he's like super good in the current metagame either. So yeah.
Okay, right, Kelsey, Emily rather. What does that actually mean for a Freak of Freaks then, that they're in this scenario with this roster? Because the bizarre thing about this team was they were top 3 for the whole first half of the split and they were looking really good. But back then they used to just keep the same lineup pretty much all the time. Then they brought in aiming, and then obviously more recently they've like alternated Mowgli and Spirit over all the last games basically. So whereabouts do you think their roster is? Like, should they have made these moves? Will they just stick with Spirit and just have the old 5 in for the playoffs? Where does this put this team? Because, you know, it's not the same 5 that we thought would play the whole split in theory.
So even though I'm not like super high on Kramer either, I always thought that he was better than aiming, and I don't know if that's just because aiming probably just lacks experience on stage. So, because they were playing, like, if I recall, this basically the same champions. But the Mowgli Spirit thing, I think, was more because Spirit is still, despite having this, Spirit's reputation to me is very weird, because he has this reputation as like this aggressive, like stifling jungler for some reason.
The thing is, everyone can go, I can tell you, Emily, everyone can go and watch a video called The 3 Spirits, and it's by someone called Kelsey Moser, and it actually outlines a lot of the misconceptions about Spirit and the different periods of his career. And then after that, if they want supplementary content,
I mean, I've ranted to Kelsey about this too.
They can also watch the Mount Rushmore, where she also talks about Spirit. I think actually that was Dexter who did that one. Actually, there's another one. All I'm saying is he's got like sort of a cult underground following with people who are analysts of the game.
I mean, my point, and this is something I've ranted to Kelsey about before, is that he, you know, like when people try to say someone's aggressive, it usually means that they've seen someone gank a lot. But Spirit has this weird aggressive moniker, yet he is a power farmer. He's a power farmer and a team fighter. And so them trying out Mowgli, I think, was them trying to do something slightly more proactive in the jungle early. It didn't always work. Like that Nocturne pick was absolutely terrible, especially when you think of like the style in which you want Nocturne to like, or, you know, what Nocturne does is basically farm for a while. So if they were going to play it, I don't see why they didn't have Spirit play it. But anyway, that was like a bizarre experiment that didn't work on like a patch too early in terms of when people were actually trying him out. But, what?
Oh, no, go ahead. I thought you were done, but go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think that's the only when I think of the roster changes or the roster swaps that they've made, which is what you asked me about, this roster substitutions, I think that that's kind of what they were going for there. I'm still not sure about the Amy and Kramer thing because, like I said, they were playing the same champions, and I thought that Kramer was better in terms of what they were using both AD carries for positioning and stuff like that in team fights. Even though I also don't think Kramer's like super strong.
Okay, so Kelsey, since we've actually never done an LCK episode, this split, no one actually knows your thoughts on a Freak of Freaks, because it's not really the sort of team you do content on at the moment when you have your limited opportunities. So what are your thoughts on the whole team?
So I think that they're a really weird version of the last Splits team, and it's almost like they shifted some sort of power and control to Marin, and we're going to play like the way Marin wants, which is how I feel every Marin team is, because he ends up playing the same 3 champions, whether it's in meta or not, and you play around his lane, etc., etc. Like, even though this has been contentious, whatever, it's the point. To a spirit-driven sort of team, like a Fnatic-esque spirit-driven team, and by that I mean like Spirit's the kind of jungler. You get into a game, you're playing AD carry, you're farming with your support, you have like an Allaire or something, so you can do a sick, like all-in level 3 dive. You see your jungler, he's doing like a full clear bot to top, and you're like already seeing how this could be super sick. Like, you've got this all set up. Maybe your support started pink ward, so they already have like brush control, and this gank is really going to go well for you. And then he goes back and he sits in your lane while you have a wave, and he sits in your bush to back and absorb the XP when he's going back to base. And this is the kind of jungler Spirit is, okay? So he's like the scumbag who is just farming up so that he can carry mid to late game. And a lot of his champion pool is like this, and a lot of the way that Africa Freaks have been playing has kind of been to enable this, even though you have like Tucson, who's had a pretty good split, I think, overall. Like, he's played a lot, carried a lot of early plays for them. He's gotten a lot of good gold leads for them. I think Kuro has been stepping up, and Keen has done better than some people may have projected of him, unless you're Fion and you were hyping this guy from day one, whatever. But I don't know. Like, Africa Freaks have been playing a lot of top lane centric comps, and they are not getting as much out of the 2v2 as teams who are playing to bot side. So, like, whenever they make a side trade, they're not getting that much out of top side, because I don't think Spirit is, like, that invested in playing the game as a top side 2v2 game or a top side 3v3 game. He's much more invested in playing this as, we have super strong top and mid picks so that I can farm that quadrant forever and just be like a massive player later. So that's kind of how I feel about Africa Freaks right now.
Emily, I actually looked it up there while she was talking and found the title of the video I was referring to. It's even better than I remembered, right? Because the title of the video, I'll set it up for you, right? It goes like this. It goes, A Tale of 3 Spirits. So already when you see it, you're thinking to yourself, holy shit, 3? I thought there was just 1. And then, she's going to go through, like, obviously the one that was at WE and the one that was at Fnatic and the one that was Samsung Blue. And you're thinking, fuck it, wow, 3 different versions. And then she pulls the old and the real one. And you're like, what? Oh my God, there's another one as well. One that none of us know, that only you, Kelsey, know. Yes. And at the end of the episode, I do reveal who the real Spirit is. Here's the thing, that's a pretty good title, actually. Yeah, that's one of your better ones.
With the titles.
That's one of your better titles, I have to say. It's good. I like the way there's a twist in the title. Like, you're reading it, like, holy shit, what? And in the end, he was Kaiser Soze. Right, okay.
Yes, he was Kaiser Soze.
The big problem with the Africa team for this playoffs is that they're actually in exactly the spot you would think of for a team that's second placed, which is they should be anyone who gets to meet them. If you look at the way the season's played out, they've been very good. But at the moment, it kind of looks like no one can beat Kingzone, at least their best of 5. What is your thought on that, Emily?
So Africa against Kingzone?
Yeah, are they the team that could do it? Because it looks like they'll be the ones playing them, right?
I don't think so, because it would require them to play Mowgli, probably. And he's been more inconsistent, despite the fact that he at least tries stuff with his lanes earlier. So I think to go up against Kingzone, you really do want to start attacking them in lane early, especially since this is a really good, it's going to be a strong meta it's going to continue to be a strong meta for Peanut. And the way they've been playing around him in the past few weeks, I think has been really good. In terms of just understanding what they have to do to facilitate him. And his 2v2 with BDD has just steadily improved. So I think when you play Spirit, they beat you early. And when you play Mowgli, he might not be consistent enough. I also just think that generally Kingzone know how to pressure side lanes a lot better than Afrika do. The way Afrika have kind of trended towards playing is going for more of this like fight style late. They're actually not like a super high kill team either, but they try to get these like ridiculous 5v5 fights, especially with Tucson and Kuro initiating on top of one another. And I think that Kingzone would be able to maneuver around the map a lot better to avoid that point from even happening, which is why I actually think, as weird as it sounds, because I don't think KT are going to beat Kingzone, and they might not even make the final. But I think if a KT with like a super strong mid laner and UCal that's communicating better with the team and has a stronger 2v2 score, or even Rush, I think that they would be able to attack Kingzone a lot better if they planned for it than Afrika and the way they play. If that makes any sense.
It's interesting to me that you say that you think that Afrika basically will beat any team that gets to face them. So do you guys both think that it's a given that Afrika beats KT then?
I think KT could win, but I think that Afrika have been more consistent. And I also think it's tough. I have like my KT bias, so it could just be me shitting on them. But I don't trust them enough to beat the Freaks in a best of 5.
This isn't about trust, Emily. This is about will they beat them or not, you know? This isn't about your heart.
They will make too many mistakes.
This is about what your brain is telling you, Emily.
This is what I'm saying. They will make too many mistakes. I cannot trust them to be a consistent team because I think they make more mistakes than Afrika.
Use that word again. The trust.
They make more mistakes than Afrika.
Okay. There you go.
Well, okay, here's the problem I have in this scenario. Is like if I had to give a factor as to why like I could like start to build the case for KT to win, one that you have to go ahead and consider is that obviously some of the Afrika Freaks players, they've never been in an LCK final, some of these guys. People like Clean, he's never done shit in his career. Tucson, okay, fairly young in his career still. Kramer was playing with CJ years ago, but it's not really that relevant now. So really, you've only got Spirit and you've got Kuro, who is super experienced in that sort of a setting. Even so, though, in that scenario, I feel like you have to already somehow speculate that like there's going to be much worse Afrika Freaks if they're going to lose the series. And on top of that, and this is the part where I won't say you need to trust KT or whatever, but I can see what Emily means in that you still need KT to win 3 games. And the problem is, I've just been watching KT roster now for 3 splits. And every single split, there are moments where they win a game and they look so dominant that you're like, holy shit, right, they can do this all the time. They can just do this for a couple of seasons. Mm-hmm. And then I don't think they've ever even done it like 2 series in a row where they just had these mega stomps. And then as soon as they get to like any 35-minute game, it's like diminishing returns every minute on out. At that point, you just start losing all faith that they could ever be the best team. So put it this way, this is the depressing part. In a world in which KT actually did go to the final, it's probably just because Afrika totally shit the bed. So that's not really the ideal scenario, because in the context I originally set it up with, you want it to be that if KT beats them, then right now they're going to be the team to beat Kingzone. They've got a chance to win. Seems unlikely. What do you think?
I think that Afrika Freaks bot lane feels a lot less reliable right now than it had, and when it was doing like super well early. And obviously Kramer was playing earlier in the season too, so I'm not quite sure why. And I think that it again comes back to the team's approach to like bot side river control, and KT have like a way better handle on it. Just in general, right? Like they've played that part of the map, I think, better throughout the season. So I'm not, and a lot of that has to do with like the jungle interference, whether they're playing with rush or score or whatever. So I'm not, even though I think that KT make like a lot of mistakes and you just can't rely on them. Okay, we'll use the word rely to consistently play the same way, or to say, oh, we found something that works and we're going to play this in the next series and it'll be really good. I think that it's the same. You can almost say the same for Afrika, because you can't, like, they show certain things that they're good at, but I don't think their play style is reliable. Like, I don't think that their approach is reliable, you know? And I think that, I believe KT are way more likely to outdraft Afrika and have like a better draft that at least gives them better win conditions than some of Afrika's drafts. So that's kind of more where I'm coming from. And then even when like Afrika have a good topside 2v2, like their topside just does not match up well to Smeb, who is basically 1v2ing in like a matchup that Afrika should win. So I don't know. So for me, it feels like KT's approach is better. So I think they win. I think they beat Afrika.
Okay, bold.
Yeah.
Right. When we talk about King Zone, this is actually a perfect example of almost like the Greek conception of the pantheon, where the gods sort of are quite capricious, right? They're not necessarily, out for humanity's best interest. In many ways, we are pawns just to be moved around for their own amusement. So obviously this split, I did do a video that was about King Zone Dragon X, and I explained that they were on trajectory for greatness. They did look like all the pieces were there. The only series they'd lost, in fact games they'd lost, were the opening 2 games against KSV, where they couldn't use Khan because he had that suspension. Now immediately after I made this video, they lost another series. They lost to, who was it they lost to in that match, Emily?
It was probably BBQ. That was their
BBQ.
only other.
That was it. But with that said, it was with the context that they lost game 1 with Khan, and then he had to go to the hospital because he was hyperventilating, and then they played the other 2 games with their sub-top laner. But ever since then, they never lost another series. So obviously, well played to the gods. They managed to make me look like a fool on that 1 week after the video, but they did end up being fucking unreal, this team. I mean, here's the context, right? They lost 7 games out of 40 that they played. So, Emily... Mm-hmm. This is a pretty dominant team, right?
Yes. I think...
Is it clear that they're going to be the LCK champion?
Yeah, I think so. Mainly just because, not that I think that they're infallible. I think there are ways to attack them. But when I look at the teams below them, I don't see a team that is strong enough yet to face them, to beat them, rather, in a best of 5. So if a team does, like say like KT comes up or Afrika comes up and faces them in the final and beats them, it will be because they will have solved the issues that we've previously discussed with these teams and figured out a good way to go up against Kingzone. But I think, so from the get-go, like in our very first series, I talked about Peanut and how he really... the inclusion of him, provided that he was going to get a strong 2v2 with BDD, was going to help them a lot, because previously you saw BDD kind of trying to cover up for some of Cuz's mistakes, because Cuz was just not as good of a jungler. And this is also a pretty strong meta for Peanut, where there are certain champions like Olaf that you really should just ban away from him. So I think that 2v2 is what I'm looking at a lot with this team. And then obviously Prey, Gorilla, and Khan, it's pretty much the same as what we saw from them last year, where Prey and Gorilla are just so reliable on the bot side still, in my opinion, that even though that's where I would look at to destabilize this team still, I don't see another team coming up that would be able to do it, especially not with the pressure that's coming out of Peanut and BDD from mid jungle. So
I think that the Kingzone, for me, like I said, I'm not as convinced that they're super dominant, but it's almost like they have
You did imply none of the LPL teams could beat them.
Yeah, I don't think LCK teams will. I think they'll win, very likely, but it's like my thing with Kingzone is that it almost feels like, okay, yes, we acknowledge that we can be approached from the bot side of the map, and now they're like plugging that hole, but they still don't necessarily know how to like vary their approach from series to series, and they haven't like shored up mid. Like their mid-centric vision is not very good, for example. So I think that's an issue that Kingzone have, and you talked about mid-jungle synergy and stuff like this. But for me, I just feel like the new patch just favors this team so unreal hard anyway. Like, you have the new Conquer Keystone, right? And then you have the, like, obviously Jhin and Ashe are being played increasingly more. So it's just you have, like, all of these things that really, really favor Kingzone in general. So I just don't... It's really hard to just say, like, they lose this in general. So, yeah.
Also, we were talking about teams that will flex Swain. I think Kingzone is absolutely a team that would do that.
I think any team will, but yeah.
Yeah, they would flex Swain into mid very easily because BDD's already played Scion as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you think about this then? Are they on the all-time trajectory though? Like, can this go on and be the best team ever?
I mean, they need time. They need more time just because it's the history around this team is already a bit weird because of what happened to them at Worlds last year, where they only played the one, you know, like it's very famously a case against the Gauntlet, right? Because they only played one best of 5 and then they went to Worlds and lost to Samsung, who prepared very well for that series. So I think for me to be a historic team, they really have to basically just continue to win things. And they need to win this title and at the very least win the MSI title. Because it would be really sad if, like, say, you know, they win, they go, and then they get beaten by like IG or something, even though I still don't think IG are there yet. But you know what I mean? Like, it's yes. For them to be like on a historic level, I feel like they need to win more, not only titles in Korea, but they need to do something outside of Korea as well while representing the region.
So I think this is a really interesting question because you have to even think about how you're framing it, because you're talking about like historic successful teams. Are you going off by brand name? Are you going off by roster? Are you going off by iconic player? Because you can even go back to like the Tigers, right? Because you have 3 members from the Tigers on this team. So if you're talking about like the legacy of those specific players, if you're talking about the legacy of Prey and Gorilla, or just like this concept of playing for strong lanes and vision, and this concept that a lot of Korean teams weren't doing because everyone was playing like SKT, you can make a pretty good case that like this type of, you can build like patches of this legacy and say maybe they compete, but it's just for as dominant as like Faker's SKT, which I think most people would agree to classify as one team, and for as strong as they were for so long and as many titles as they won, it's just really hard to say like another team will usurp the greatest team of all time situation at this point. Like, maybe if they keep this dominant run throughout the end of the year, we can open the conversation again, but yeah.
Why do people do that though? Because to me, like, those are all different teams. I mean, I know like maybe it has the parallel with sports, where obviously in sports it's very unlikely, especially with like the NFL, that you can't keep the same roster. Yeah. Like the contracts don't work that way. But to me, like, each of the SK Telecoms were all different teams. I've especially never understood people linking up the season 3 one with the season 5 and the season 6 and the season 7. I never got that connection, because to me they're so drastically different. There's almost no connection. You know, you can't say 2 players as a core.
I think that it has, in my head, it has a lot to do with like the core approach to the game.
Yeah, so sure, if I feel like element.
If I feel like the core approach to the game has changed significantly, then it has to be a different team, or not just significantly, but at all. If the core approach to the game is like really, really similar, maybe you didn't even keep like that many players. Maybe you just have the same coach or something in the same org. and the same philosophy, and that still feels kind of like the same team to me, So it's a bit of an interesting question, especially as like staffs get more built up, or as like people get more entrenched in longer player contracts and decide like this is our core 2 or this is our core 3. The way that people define teams, I think, might change a little bit more in League of Legends. Yeah.
What about this then? If we take the way you've just framed it, the stylistic approach that this team has, combined with its roster, is the potential there to be the best team ever?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, even taking that context, I think you wait till the end of the year before you start opening the conversation. I don't know why. I always just feel like this team will end up failing. It's very strange. It's a strange
still
feeling.
Have that in their DNA from the Tigers days?
Yeah, I don't know. The Tigers days also just like the weakness that you could see coming from a mile away last year, and then they show up at Worlds, even though like I was even saying that, they might win. I think I predicted SKT, which is even more hilarious, but whatever the situation is, it feels like this team has like very obvious flaws that they aren't able to address, but they're probably aware of them themselves. And it's just they're able to like make them work, especially when the meta suits them, especially when their jungler is actually, I think the way Peanut is playing is really, really good. In terms of the meta, because like with the dissipation of the tracker's knife, like his style of play of just like getting eyes on the jungle is actually so good. So yeah, there are just like a lot of things that really favor this team right now and will help them succeed, even if so. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, right, Emily. This split, the MVP was the same MVP as last split. It was BDD again. Do you agree with this?
So if you remember in the very first episode, I think I actually did pick BDD, if I recall correctly. Man, MVP for this split, BDD is a good one. I would actually, for Kingzone specifically, I might lean towards Peanut. But then again, there were like the very beginning communication issues with him, and him not really gelling with BDD immediately. And then they put Cousin for some ungodknown reason. But yeah, it was BDD and Kuro. Man, I was kind of hoping it was Kuro's year too, considering they like tied last year, and the way that MVP works is pretty. Yeah, honestly, if I had to pick an MVP from Kingzone, I think it would be Peanut. And then if I had to pick an MVP from Afrika, it would actually probably be... it's tough. I was going to say Tucson, but then he also does some weird, dumb things too. And Kuro's very reliable. I'd have to get back to you. I would say Peanut is, in terms of like what I consider a most valuable player. I think the value that he's provided to Kingzone is really, really important for how much improved they look, or like how much stronger, I guess, they have looked over the regular season.
Who do you pick, Kelsey?
I'm boring enough. I'm the guy who always picks Pearson for TSM, who always picks Faker for SKT, and I'm just like always gonna pick Prey for this team. So like he's the best player. He's the one, like, I think it's very clear, especially this split, that if Khan feeds his ass off, no one cares. They win anyway. If like Prey has a bad game, like the entire thing falls apart. So like for me, it's just, it has to be Prey. So yeah.
Because this is one of the things that makes this team quite insane, right? Is that if you add up everything you just said there, I mean, we haven't even mentioned the fact that some people would pick Khan as the MVP, because obviously he's had so many games where he just ran over the other guy. So what's mental is we've collectively got 4 MVP candidates out of one team. The only person we haven't put in is Gorilla, basically.
And that's just because he's a support and everyone hates those guys. I know it is like the way that this team plays, though. It's like I have said before, it's very easy for every single player to look good. And yeah, they do have good players, like potentially I won't say the best, but like definitely top 2, whatever. Not top 2, but like top 3, 4, whatever.
Thing, okay, it's like I've said in the past. I've actually said this on this show. This is one of the few teams where I don't even mind that like rationale of like maybe they do have almost the best players. They kind of do in a way, you know. Even if they don't, they're like, as you're saying, minimum top 3 for nearly every role.
Yeah,
and, like realistically, without
top 4. I mean, it's for me the reason why it's so easy for these players to look good is part of this team's philosophy. Like if you want all of your players to get all pro or whatever, to get MVP, you just go in and you draft a winning lane for every single one of them, and then you like win games in 20 minutes because people will be like, oh, this guy's so sick, he averages 20 CSD above his opponents at 10 minutes, literally smashing everyone in every lane. And it's like, okay, literally winning matchups drafted for him every time. And then you just give the coach MVP because how does he get 3 winning fucking lanes every single game for his players? But yeah, it's just for me, I don't know. This is like one of those situations where it's a little weird and touch and go in that point. But I do definitely I think BDD for sure, Prey, Gorilla at least, like top 1, top 2 for sure. So yeah,
because I think people know that I'm not a fan of the way the MVP is decided in the LCK. And all I'll do is this. I'll use the classic Thorin approach, which is rather than just make a 20-minute video arguing about it, for the sake of this show, I will just say this, okay? If there's anyone out there who thinks that this system is good, you are co-signing a system that tells you that Bang was a better player in the LCK than Teddy. That's what you're co-signing. You're a part of this. And you will be against the wall when fucking Revolution comes, because in what universe could that ever be true? Yeah. Couldn't. It's just that you have to win the game to get the Player of the Game award, and so obviously it's impossible if you're on fucking Jin Air. So for me, that kind of actually just shows how stupid that is. But okay. What about this then? In the LCK, this split, there's been an incredible amount of parity, Kelsey. Like, even though not in the traditional sense people might think of, like you sometimes, for example, in LCS for a while, there was loads of teams tied, etc. I mean parity even in the sense of like, if you were to make a tier list, you'd need quite a few tiers. You might legitimately need 5 tiers to do the LCK, you know. There never was, you know, the top contenders and then the would-be's and then the middle one and then who gives a shit, you know. There really were. And actually, if you look at the season, all these bottom teams got amazing upset wins actually over the split, every single one of them at some point in time. In light of how dominant Kingzone was, I want you to kind of like resolve the equation for me. Was the fact that the league had so much parity, is that because aside from Kingzone, there wasn't as many good teams and that's why there was degrees of parity? Is this one of the best splits you think LCK or Korea has ever had?
It's been really fun to watch because, like, if you don't wake up in the morning on time or whatever, and you check the schedule, it's like, yeah, it's a Kingzone game. I'll catch it later. It'll probably take me like an hour max to go through. What the fuck? They lost to BBQ? But yeah. So I think there were a lot of things like that like motivated you to see, okay, I'm excited. I'm invested in this team and I really want to see how they do. Like, Rocks, BBQ tried to make a run, Jin Air tried to make a run, but at the same time, it still felt like you kind of knew which teams would make it. And maybe the order wasn't the same as you expected. Like, you kind of knew it would be Kingzone, SKT, KSV, KT, and then like Afrika would probably be in there at the end, you know? So to an extent, it was like super exciting and there was super high parity, but at the same time, it was like, yeah, we still have the same teams doing shit, so... Yeah.
What about for you, Emily? Where does this split stack up?
So in terms of like, I have to separate champions from LCK. So I don't think I'd ever say that an LCK split has been the best that we've seen out of South Korea. I still think that belongs to season 4. But in terms of post LCK, I think this is actually one of the most interesting splits, especially because you did have teams that I really appreciated, even if they were like frustrating to watch, like Rocks or Jin Air, where you could tell they were really trying to play around what they had and they recognized what they had. And even if their execution was sometimes really bad, at the very least, I really enjoyed seeing so many teams have such a strong understanding of their arrangement of players and how they could play around them. And that's why I'm specifically naming like Jenner and Rox, because I think those are two teams that did absolutely recognize at least how they could win with their assortment of players. It didn't always happen that way because they would make a lot of execution errors. But in terms of that, it was, I would say this is actually my most liked split. Like this was the split that I've been the most entertained by since the LCK has started.
And it was interesting to see like some of these players who've been around a little bit who kind of got like shoved into the teams as a result of like a bunch of legacy players leaving or retiring or whatever. And then they've just kind of been sitting around and suddenly they're the veterans. Suddenly they're the ones with like some game knowledge and they're able to lead their like crap teams to do interesting things. So like you see players like Linderong who suddenly looks better. You see players like Teddy, who obviously was going to be really good, and like people knew he was going to be really good, and now he's not a rookie anymore, and he's like a fully fleshed out like sick AD carry. And so yeah, I think it's been really exciting from that perspective, because it feels like a lot of players who you thought of as rookies for a while now feel like veterans. And so for me, that's really cool.